In today's video, I'm going to be bringing you guys along as I transform my home lab setup right here. So this is my network rack, or at least what's left of it from my most recent move. For the longest time, I've wanted something more sophisticated, something a lot cleaner and more functional in general. So what I'm going to be doing today is building a 4-post 42, I think it's a 42U rack. And then I'm going to go ahead and stack that thing beautifully with all sorts of different devices. Stick with me throughout this video. There's a lot of things that you might learn or pick up from this video. And I'm gonna be doing this one with my brother. This entire server rack is the brains. It's everything that connects my entire home together. This right here is my Unraid server. So I built this thing, I think about 2 years ago, and then I updated it at least one time in those 2 years. And it's been one of my favorite things as a content creator because it allows me to have access to a ton of storage. Like on this thing right now, I've got over 50 terabytes, which is insane. That's like amazing for a content creator. I've got some Unify devices up here as well. So these two I've picked up and invested in over 2 years ago. Something that's got me really excited about putting together my new home lab setup is the fact that I've hardwired the entire basement and everything that's going to be in my studio space. So I'm so excited to see how all of those come into play. All right, let's go ahead and do this. Before we began setting up the new rack, I had to first dismantle my makeshift setup and clean out the space. Normally it's not this dusty, but the ongoing basement construction made it nearly impossible to keep the area clean for more than a day or two. Thankfully though, the cleanup didn't take very long and soon enough, the space was ready for the upgrade. About a week ago, I picked up a StarTech 42U 19-inch server rack with an open frame design, which I thought would be perfect for the new setup that I'd envisioned. With plans to add several devices, I needed something very spacious, and this rack easily fit that bill. The rack came in multiple pieces, including cable management hooks to organize wiring along the posts. The manual, however, wasn't very helpful, so we improvised by following the finished image as a guide. Starting with the base, we worked our way all the way to the top. Assembly took longer than we had expected, but between the two of us, we got it all done pretty quickly. The final product was a sturdy 4-post rack with an adjustable depth of 22 to 40 inches, which we set at 24 inches. It also came with casters, which is going to come in very handy for moving the rack around once it's fully loaded. At the top, we decided to mount the components for my home network, which distributes internet across the rack, the basement, and the entire house. My previous setups used Unify devices for consistency, so the plan was to expand on this or replace components as needed. At the top, we installed two 1U 24-port patch panels and a 1U cable pass-through spacer for better cable management. Below that, we mounted my old 24-port Unify PoE switch, as well as a Dream Machine Pro from Unify, which is going to be the brain of the ecosystem. We left some gaps for flexibility as we continued to figure out how everything else would fit into the space. We left the setup as is temporarily and added a 1U 10-inch deep vented shelf for devices that couldn't be directly mounted. Placing it 6 units below the Dream Machine allowed enough space for smart hubs and routers of varying heights. To set the gap, we used the tallest device, the main internet router, as a guide. Before adding the smart hubs and other devices, we decided to build out the rest of the rack first. Starting at the bottom, we installed the first heavy-duty shelf with an adjustable depth that filled the entire depth of the rack and then some. It's rated for up to 250 pounds and features full ventilation across the entire bottom. These features were crucial since the shelf had to hold my NAS PC and Plex media server as well as a UPS. Installing this shelf took more time and effort than the shorter one up top since it required mounting to all 4 posts of the rack. The surface turned out super solid, and when we put the NAS up on there to test it out, it held it up there like a champ. Above the bottom shelf, we installed a 16-inch deep vented shelf. This one would house my digital PS5 console, which I've now had since its 2020 launch. While this rack primarily serves as home to my networking and smart home equipment, it's also become a central hub for a lot of my multimedia devices. On the opposite side of the wall, I'm setting up a home theater that I plan to connect directly to the rack's media devices, including the PS5. I placed the console on the shelf horizontally to save space before moving on to the next component. As the build progressed, I had a clear vision for the rack's power supply setup. While my previous builds relied on devices connected directly to a UPS, this time I wanted more control. To monitor and manage power usage across the entire rack, I decided to pick up the Unify Power Distribution Pro unit. It's designed to supply power to an entire rack-mounted system and lets you manage each connection remotely through the Unify app. For rack mounting, the unit occupies 2U of space but requires only 2 posts for installation, so we mounted it on the rear post to keep power cables away from the front. After installing the Power Distribution Pro, I added my first smart hubs, the Lutron and Hunter Douglas controllers. The Lutron hub manages all of my Lutron smart home devices and will connect directly to my Unify switch for a more reliable control of lights and shades. Although the Hunter Douglas hub lacks an Ethernet port and will be the only hub without a direct connection to the switch, I still decided to place it here to keep all of my hubs centralized. Alongside the Lutron hub, it only controls a select amount of premium shades installed throughout the house. After connecting all the hubs, we tackled organizing the Ethernet cables and speaker wires that ran throughout the house to the mechanical room. Using the server rack's included cable hooks, we created neat pathways along the sides for cable management. And despite a large number of cables, my brother and I managed to organize everything within a few hours. Next, we began identifying and labeling each Ethernet cable while terminating them with Cat6 connectors. Since we couldn't complete this task in one day, we decided to pause the build while waiting for additional Unify products to arrive. As soon as the 1U 24-port patch panels arrived, we replaced the original ones with them. We also reorganized the top section of the rack, starting from the first opening and eliminating gaps between the Dream Machine and the PoE switch. The new arrangement looked much better, with all the Unify devices at the top fitting together very seamlessly. This reorganization required us to adjust the Smart Hub shelf's height, though we kept the power supply unit in its original position for the time being. Below the hubs, we mounted another heavy-duty shelf identical to the one holding the NAS PC at the bottom of the rack. This one I needed to hold a decent-sized HP DeskJet printer that I only used occasionally. Since I could never find a good spot for it anywhere else, I decided to add it here. We used the printer's heights to determine the spacing before mounting the heavy-duty shelf, which took up a total of 5U of space. Once installed, I placed the printer on the shelf and then went ahead and added a smaller terminal printer behind it, which I use for printing shipping labels. Next, I added an AV receiver to the rack for the home theater setup in the opposite room. Before this, I had temporarily removed the PS5 and installed an amplifier to handle all the in-ceiling and in-wall speakers installed throughout the basement. The AV receiver acts as a central hub for the home theater, connecting a projector, a 7.1 Dolby Atmos surround sound system, and media devices like my PS5 and TV box. I went ahead and mounted a 16-inch deep tray directly above it, which then became the new home of the PS5. 3 units above the PS5 shelf, we mounted a unique pull-out style keyboard tray, different from all the other shelves that we've installed at the rack. Unlike the vented shelves used elsewhere, this one was pretty solid and can be used as a pull-out storage drawer or a control station for a display, a keyboard, and a mouse. With a 22-inch depth, it nearly spanned the entire rack, and its pull-out mechanism was the only thing that required mounting to all 4 posts. Once the shelf was installed, I added a 17-inch portable monitor, a Bluetooth keyboard, and a mouse. Next, we returned to terminating and labeling the Ethernet cables for the switch. This was a very time-consuming process since crimping each cable is very tedious, and we had over 30 of them to do for the entire house. We also organized and prepared all the speaker wires during this step. This included 8 speaker wires from the home theater setup connected to the AV receiver, 4 wires from the open basement for in-ceiling speakers, and 2 additional wires for future outdoor speakers. The next thing I added was an old UPS system that I've had since my first homelab setup. I strongly recommend integrating a UPS into any setup like this one, since it provides uninterrupted power supply, which I find to be essential. I placed it on the bottom shelf right behind my NAS and Plex media server, where it fit perfectly, and then went ahead and connected the Unify Power Distribution Pro directly to it. This setup ensures that every device in the rack has uninterrupted power supply, protecting it against potential hardware damage or data loss from forced shutdowns. Prior to installing the next shelf, I ordered a Sonos amp system to control and power all 4 in-ceiling speakers in the open basement area. It's equipped with only a single left and right channel, which meant I could only group all 4 speakers into a single zone. This wasn't a big issue for me since I planned to use them as a single unit, though if I needed multiple zones, I would have needed a different amplifier. Setting up the system was pretty straightforward. I connected the speaker wires and then configured everything through the Sonos and the Apple Home apps. So this has now quickly become the central point of operation for pretty much everything in the entire house. And this goes all the way from multimedia down to general storage. Right now we're about to add the final item to this rack. And we had to wait for that to ship. It was the last item that I had to think about a few times before I decided to pull the trigger and actually buy it. So it's a 48 PoE switch that will allow me to be able to power everything that I've got in the house, everything that's wired through Ethernet. So I've got a bunch of cables, probably 30 plus Ethernet cables wired throughout the entire house. So my 24 port PoE switch was not able to handle that. So now I've got the 48 PoE switch and picked it up recently from Ubiquiti to obviously line up with everything else that I've got right here. Installing the 48 PoE ether lighting switch was pretty quick and easy considering we only needed to remove one item. Once we secured it in the rack and connected power to it, all 48 ports illuminated immediately. While the switch was booting up and going through its setup process, we finished terminating the remaining Cat6 cables. I also installed two 10 GSFP connectors to create a 10 gigabit bridge between the main switch and my NAS PC below. While Ty was terminating the Ethernet cables, he also installed Cat6 Keystone jacks I picked up off Amazon for the patch panels. I had to pick up 225 packs in order to fill all 48 port openings on both patch panels. While this was being done from behind, I connected all 48 ports on the switch to the patch panels. I'd purchased two sets of 24 pack ether lighting patch cables alongside the switch when I picked that up. Though they were available in various lengths, I chose very short ones to create a clean, consistent look across all 48 ports. I specifically chose these cables because they work in tandem with the switch to maximize the ether lighting feature, which honestly is one of the reasons I picked up the ether lighting switch. After connecting everything, the final look was super clean and consistent across the entire home network section. The rack's open design also makes it easy to modify components as needed, which I find to be a huge benefit. From the back, I can quickly connect and disconnect Ethernet cables, while the front has all 48 ports connected with light indicators showing which ones are active and their current speeds. This makes it very easy and simple to identify different types of connections at a quick glance. After reviewing the final build, I realized that I needed a temperature sensor, which is an essential for a setup like this one. While the rack's open design provides excellent airflow, I decided to add an ecobee smart sensor to the shelf with the smart hubs as well. This compact sensor works with an ecobee smart thermostat to monitor room temperature wherever it's placed. So it's going to alert me if the rack's temperature rises too high, allowing me to address any issues before they cause permanent damage. Setup is super simple. All you gotta do is pretty much pair the sensor with the ecobee app, then follow the prompts on the screen to configure it and choose an ideal placement. For a finishing touch, I added DIY RGB lighting to the rack using a few items from Amazon: a Cobb RGB strip, a 24-volt power supply, and a smart controller. After everything arrived in the mail, it took me less than 10 minutes to install the strip on the two front posts. And then once powered on, I connected it to the Smart Life app where I could control various scenes and settings. The ambient lighting effect elevated the rack's overall aesthetic, giving it the perfect finishing touch. All that was left was regular maintenance and cleaning, something that I know I will need to do often to keep this setup running smoothly. For cleaning, I used a combination of microfiber cloth, water, and a compact air duster. I'm super stoked with how everything turned out and how the whole setup came together, and I cannot wait to see how it holds up and what cool upgrades I can add later. Hey, if you stuck around this long, you're awesome. And hopefully I can catch you in my next video. Peace out.